I'll request Arunabha, please, to share your views.
Thank you, Anshu, and thanks, Navroz, for setting us off. As Navroz said, we are within those boundary conditions of, don't commit to something that's impossible and not doing anything. We are all somewhere in the middle of it. But I wanted to just approach this slightly differently, because now that, in the last 2 or 3 weeks we've had, a huge amount of conversation going on through our respective articles and others, many others, on this issue. I'm a little worried, and I'll tell you what I'm worried about. Number one, I am worried about us making commitments without that kind of analytical base, without understanding what it all means, which is why all these different studies, etc., are necessary. And we have to do a lot more as well. That's one part of it. But there's another part of it. The other part of this is that once we realize that something is difficult, that we should not impulsively, instinctively, and when I say we, I don't mean the epistemic community on this webinar. I mean the much broader court of public opinion that Mr. Prabhu was referring to, that we don't default to a therefore we shouldn't do anything, and therefore the ball lies in some other court. And we've played this table tennis match for nearly 3 decades since the FCCC was first drafted, of whose responsibility it is to act. So how do we frame a narrative that is both consistent with something that demonstrates that India is acting, and acting in fact disproportionately in a sort of climate leader kind of way, but at the same time frame the narrative that this is not just in our interest as a country, but that we need to do this because it's not about the energy transformation, it's the economic disruption. Um, just to quote somebody who tweeted out our report, and he tagged it as, "This changes everything. बाद में मत बताना बोला नहीं था," right? And it's interesting, right? That how do we make this conversation about decarbonization of the economy, about the next generation of technologies, about a completely new way of thinking about our financial system, about just transition for jobs, as a mainstream conversation? At CW, I keep talking to my colleagues, how do we go from talking about this in the margins to talking about everything that we do and our colleagues and our collaborators on this call do into the mainstream? And the framing for that is what I've called it the seeming impossible trinity of jobs, growth, and sustainability. But is there a way to keep measuring every policy measure, every sectoral target, every state-driven initiative, every central government initiative through those filters of, does this create new jobs? Does this bring in new investment, create more growth? And yet, is it also sustainable? So I don't want our worry about the net zero kind of targeting or lack thereof to then flip to the other side that therefore we shouldn't. I know I have just a couple more minutes. I do want to say one more thing, which is that on the international stage, I think India needs to come out a little bit more boldly in terms of what net zero itself means. And if the world has to get to net zero at 2050, then it can't be that everybody starts at 2050. If the biggest polluters are not going to get to net zero earlier, then how does the law of averages apply? Unless you assume that in a race, everyone wins simultaneously exactly at the same millisecond. That's not how the reality works. And because we've not engaged on the net zero topic, globally or nationally, we've not articulated this point that what the IPCC demands for the planet cannot be the same demand of every country. And that then brings us to the issues that Mr. Prabhu also mentioned, that what we decide today should be based on what we know today. But what we can do tomorrow will depend on what develops between today and tomorrow. And therefore, can we have contingent commitments even from India's side? that set that direction of travel, do the sectoral near-term things that Navroz has been talking about, and yet be flexible enough to move faster, more aggressively as the technology changes, as the investment opportunity changes, but don't do it only as a recipient of someone's, you know, generosity. Do it as a co-participant in developing those disruptive technologies, as a co-participant in developing new financial models of new taxonomies. Not just adopt the EU taxonomy and then hope for the best. Not just hope that someone else will develop CCS or green hydrogen or storage. And that's a much harder ask because it has nothing to do with international negotiations. It has all to do with us believing that the future we want as a country, let alone for the planet, the economy we want, the structure of the economy we want, has to be something we build and we create. And if we don't have that conversation, we will only have a conversation about negotiations and what we state rather than what we do in the mainstream of our economic discourse.